Greetings, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is an over 100-year-old faith-based policy and organizing network. Our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a justice-seeking United Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. We're excited to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our partners, United Methodist for Kairos Response, UMKR. We acknowledge this land and the many lands that you are joining us from, its history and all the beings seen and unseen, known and unknown. And as we step into our work on this land, most of us uninvited guests, we offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice, devoting ourselves to justice as we strive to uplift the legacy of this place and these many places. We invite you to acknowledge the indigenous land of where you are joining us from and type that in the chat. A few announcements concerning our call today. By participating in our webinars, we covenant together to co-create an equitable and brave space where we learn, engage, and grow in relationship together. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. And as you have questions, please type them in the chat box. You can type them at any time. You can direct them to myself. I'll show up as Methodist Federation for Social Action. Closed captioning is automatically generated and available, and you can click on that to see that. Do expect that there will be spelling errors because that is automatically generated. I do have the pleasure of introducing you to Teresa Basile. Teresa is a communications director, education chair, and co-founder of United Methodist for Kairos Response, a recent board member of Friends of Sabile North America, and she has served in leadership with the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Throughout her years in the United Methodist Church, she has engaged in inclusive and intersectional justice and peace advocacy on a wide range of issues. Teresa currently serves on the leadership teams of the Western Methodist Justice Movement and the CalPAC Conference, MFSA. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Bridget. That was a lovely welcome. And it is wonderful to see you all here today. Thank you for being with us. As you know, we're about to begin a program about the achievements that changed our church, and we hope the world, at the last General Conference in the spring of this year. We'll be celebrating those achievements. But before we move to that program, I think it's important to acknowledge what's happening right now in Palestine, which is certainly at odds with the idea of celebrating. We know that the horrific genocide in Gaza is continuing unabated. And every day we are hearing about massacres of the very safe zones that Israel has told refugees to flee to for safety, schools and churches and mosques and hospitals, all areas that should be considered off limits for anyone in the world. And not to mention the very humanitarian workers who are meant to bring aid to those desperate people are being targeted. And the journalists and the media centers that could bring the truth of what's happening to the world. And all of this we know has the full support of the United States government, regardless of their empty calls for restraint. The U.S. keeps replenishing Israel's arsenal to carry out even more slaughter of innocents. And that slaughter we know has surpassed 40,000 people now killed outright by the military. And experts are estimating close to 200,000 have died due to injuries and famine and disease. And of course, that number is going to continue to rise. And in the West Bank, now we're also seeing heightened violence, a worse assault than they've experienced in 20 years. And settlers are rampaging weekly without any restraint by the government. In fact, these vigilantes are being armed by the government. And all of this horror and this violence that we're hearing about there, I think for many of us, it could make the efforts we do at organizing in our denomination and passing legislation at events like General Conference seem irrelevant or unimportant. But that isn't all that we do. For 11 months, we've been advocating and protesting and writing and calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and for access for humanitarian aid and for the release of hostages and political prisoners, and for an end of the siege on the West Bank. But we know that while all of that is going on and we're doing that, we also need to keep doing our organizing for the long-term goals. We need to change hearts and minds in millions of people throughout our denomination and throughout our societies. And that's what we can do with this other kind of organizing that we're celebrating today in the first part of our webinar. It does make an impact on thousands of United Methodists in our denomination, and through the public witness of our church with these things we did at General Conference, we're also making an impact on millions of people in our society. And that is the context and the purpose for the General Conference achievements we'll be hearing about today regarding Palestine. So in the first part of our webinar, we're going to be focusing on legislation and action for Palestine and Israel at General Conference. The first thing we will hear about is original legislation that UMKR developed and submitted to General Conference along with our partners in MFSA and the Love Your Neighbor Coalition. Then we're going to learn about some long-standing and important United Methodist resolutions on Palestine that have come from our general agencies and that needed to be renewed this year. And then we'll close part one with a look at some other actions that made Palestine a prominent theme at General Conference this year. And then in part two, we will hear about other history-making and church-transforming legislation from General Conference about regionalization and the revised social principles and ending the United Methodist Church's discriminatory policies toward our LGBTQ siblings. So for our first presentation, we have Lisa Bender. She is a co-chair of the Steering Committee of United Methodist for Kairos Response. She also leads UMKR's Boycott and Divestment Committee, and she serves on the leadership team of the Love Your Neighbor Coalition. Lisa retired after 18 years as the executive secretary for the Director of Connectional Ministries in the Susquehanna Conference in Pennsylvania, and she continues to serve her conference in several boards and agencies. She was a delegate to General Conference in 2012, 16, 19, and this year, 2024. And Lisa's going to be presenting for us, as I said, those major pieces of legislation related to Palestine that UMKR developed and that we and our partners in MFSA and LYNC brought to General Conference. So welcome, Lisa.
All right. Thank you all. Thanks, Teresa, and thank you all for joining us. So as Christians and as human beings, the future of Palestine and Israel is our prayerful and activist concern. I know I've been working on this issue for 12 years, and I know many of you have worked on it longer than that. But, you know, I am finally so pleased this year to report about the resolutions that were adopted at General Conference. The United Methodist Church at the administrative levels and in our congregations needs to be prophetic and speak to this horrible situation in our world where apartheid and genocide are taking place. So today I'll be talking about the 3 new resolutions that UMKR wrote that were adopted at General Conference. And I do hope that you'll highlight them to your congregations. First, I'll lift up our proudest accomplishment, a divestment resolution. It is titled Exclude Government Debt of Countries Involved in Prolonged Military Occupation. The General Conference also adopted two others I'll talk about, one that addresses Israeli detention of children, and the other dealing with our right to boycott. So first, let me tackle the divestment of government bonds of countries maintaining prolonged military occupations. That's quite a mouthful. The term sovereign debt is also used interchangeably for government bonds because by purchasing government bonds, the owners of the bonds are paying for that country's debt. I'll be using the term government bonds as that's a little more understandable. So what does a country carrying out a military occupation of another people need money for? Well, for its military that are enforcing the occupation and for all the related aspects of keeping their foot down on a population that is seeking its freedom. Owners of that country's government debt are therefore complicit with the human rights violations done by that country. Now, international law allows countries to occupy land they've claimed by war for short periods of time. And during that time of brief occupation, the occupying force is required to care for the people it occupies, to provide basic needs, housing, food, education, healthcare. The occupying force is also forbidden to move its own civilians onto that occupied land. So when an occupation is prolonged and seems to be leading to annexation, it is then considered illegal under international law. Now, in the world at this time, experts in international law have identified 3 such occupations that have been in effect for 50 years or more. That's 50. And thus we call them prolonged. So they are Turkey, their occupation of Northern Cyprus, Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara, and Israel's occupation of Palestine. These 3 occupations are also the subject of multiple UN Security Council resolutions and International Court of Justice rulings that say these occupations must end. Now, the United Methodist Church has stated its strong opposition to Israel's military occupation for decades, as we will hear from Colleen Moore, who will speak later. What we've said in this divestment resolution is that United Methodist should not own or purchase the bonds in those governments. And this is the first time in the world that a Christian denomination has officially stated that its opposition to these brutal and illegal occupations is just so strong that we must put that opposition into practice in our investment policy. We must refuse to invest in the bonds of these governments, Turkey, Morocco, and Israel. With the adoption of this resolution, the United Methodist Church has taken the powerful advocacy tool of divestment and applied it directly to the source, these national governments that the world community has branded as long-term occupier regimes. And remember that government bondholders are seen as supporting that government, even as it's violating human rights. And also the government bonds are financially risky in these conflict-affected areas. Now, as in many denominations, any of our resolutions, this one and others, are not absolutely binding on those who manage the church's investments. They are advisory, but they carry a powerful message to those managers that cannot be easily ignored. So our next steps related to this resolution include mobilizing those who support it to highlight this resolution in any and all places in the United Methodist Church where bonds of these governments may be in their investment portfolios. One of those places is our own investing arm of the United Methodist Church, our pension board, known as Westpath Benefits and Investments, which we know does own the government bonds of the 3 countries we named, Turkey, Morocco, and Israel. And so UMKR is in conversation with investment leaders at Westpath pushing them, encouraging them to divest these bonds. If you are a pension holder with Westpath, if you're clergy or a lay employee of the denomination, we encourage you to contact Westpath and let them know that you support this resolution and encourage them to divest these government bonds. One way to do this will be through a petition that UMKR will create for clergy to indicate their support. And we'll share this petition with Westpath. So look for more news on that later this fall. And if you know any of the board members of Westpath, talk to them. They can also ask staff to carry out this divestment. UMKR is considering drafting a resolution that annual conferences could use to echo the call for this divestment from occupier governments. So you can also ask your church's finance leaders if your church holds any of these government bonds and help them understand why they should not. I have personally told my investment advisor to not include these bonds in my portfolio. And in addition, I gave them a list of companies that are complicit in Israel's occupation that I don't want to own. And you can do that too. So we plan to have a study guide about divestment for you to use that will also include these companies. So I want to move on now to one of the ways that Palestinians suffer is experiencing Israeli military and government mistreatment of their children. So we're hearing the sad reports of deaths of so many children now in Gaza, but what I'm going to say is in reference to children in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Each year, the Israeli military subjects 700 or more Palestinian children, ages 12 and up, to their notorious military detention and military court system that lack the basic standards for due process. The children are treated with brutality, tried in courts lacking minimum standards of justice, and sentenced to military prisons in cruel conditions. This happens regularly and is meant to scar the children for life, which it does. This treatment of Palestinian children is unconscionable, but many in our churches do not know that this happens. Thus, the reason for our resolutions. And there were two slightly different versions, but both were adopted. One is titled Addressing Israeli Detention of Children, and the other was simply called Israeli Detention of Children. One asks that our general agencies, the General Board of Global Ministries, General Board of Church and Society, and our United Women of Faith, to consult together on a plan to educate and inform United Methodists about Israeli military detention of children and what United Methodists can do to prevent this treatment of vulnerable children. So our follow-up to that resolution is that we will be in touch with those general agencies and we will see that they do this consultation process. And of course, we'll offer to serve as resources for them. And the second child-related resolution calls for the United States government to adopt legislation ensuring the United States does not finance Israel's military detention of Palestinian children. Such legislation has been submitted to Congress over many years, and the current bill is called House Bill 3103. It asks Congress to monitor how and where U.S. aid is used for destructive abuse of Palestinian human rights, and to stop those violations from being funded with United States taxpayers' money. So a way that you can follow up with this resolution is to sign the action alert, which I think will be being put into the chat. And it's from our website. It will send a message to your legislators asking them to support HR 3103. So I'd encourage you also to give this information to your congregation and invite them to do the action alert. UMKR will continue to build support for this bill in Congress and will keep you abreast of the progress it makes as it moves through the U.S. legislative system. Now, for the third topic of the resolutions that UMKR wrote for General Conference, this third topic was around our right to boycott. And that resolution is named Protecting the Right to Peacefully Address Injustice. In 1982, a Supreme Court case declared that citizens have a constitutionally protected right to boycott. But this is now being challenged by laws passed in 38 states and several other countries that seek to penalize or punish anyone who is supporting boycotts or divestment actions for Palestinian human rights. In many cases, including my state of Pennsylvania, state laws adopted under pressure from Israel lobby groups require anyone who wants a contract with their state government to sign a pledge that they will not engage in a boycott of Israel or related actions. You know, I find this very offensive. I have the freedom to boycott guaranteed by our Constitution. But now Israel lobby groups say I can't boycott Israel. These laws are unconstitutional. Others find these laws offensive as well. Some of the laws have been challenged in courts, and the challengers have won. This is a free speech issue protected by the First Amendment. Our resolution says, and I quote, "The United Methodist Church opposes any interference by any local, regional, or national government in our right to address injustice through nonviolent economic means," unquote. The church also urges all members and church bodies to contact local and national government leaders to advocate against the suppression of our rights and advocate that they be overturned. You know, as seekers of justice, we need to remember that boycotts have been excellent tools for social change, used by the United Methodist Church and other religious communities for decades, even centuries. As early as 1791, our founder, John Wesley, supported a boycott of sugar as a way to protest the evils of slavery and the slave trade. In recent years, the United Methodist Church has supported boycotts related to apartheid in South Africa. We boycotted the Nestle company because of its marketing of infant formula to developing countries. We boycotted Taco Bell for its treatment of workers. The list could go on and on. Now, this may be news to you, but the United Methodist Church also calls for a global ban or boycott on products from Israeli settlements in occupied territory. And Westpath has put 5 Israeli banks on a no-buy list due to violations of Palestinian human rights. So how are we going to follow up with this one? Well, with recent efforts by universities to stop students from protesting Israel's war on Gaza, we have reason to be very concerned about our constitutional rights, especially those related to free speech. So UMKR will consider a future resolution for annual conferences to indicate our support for those participating in demonstrations. You can learn more at our website where that particular resolution can be found. There's a lot more information. One other thing you can do is join a coalition in your state that might be working on stopping or repealing these laws. We know that in New York State, for instance, there is a Freedom to Boycott Coalition. And I believe that in other parts of our United States, there are groups working together to try and stop or overturn these laws. So to recap, 3 topics UMKR presented to General Conference were adopted. And now it's up to all of us to be sure that our churches learn about these positions. UMKR is here to help, so just be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was a wonderful, comprehensive, and very understandable explanation of these 3 hugely important issues that were addressed, and successfully so, at General Conference. And in particular, we do celebrate the passage of the divestment resolution as the first such action by a church to divest from Israeli government bonds in the world. And now we're going to hear about some other foundational and hugely important Palestine legislation in our denomination. And these were not new. These needed to be renewed this year, but they have been the positions of our church for a long time. They have been brought to the church over the years by general agencies of our church. And to tell us about them, we have Colleen Moore. She is the Director of Peace with Justice at the General Board of Church and Society. And she is responsible for developing and managing that agency's legislative and policy advocacy in support of peace and justice and advancing GBCS priorities of peace building, conflict resolution, non-proliferation and disarmament, and multilateralism. Prior to joining GBCS staff, Colleen has served at Women Cross DMZ, Global Zero, Beyond the Bomb, Win Without War, and Seeds of Peace. And she has consulted with several organizations, including AFSC and Quincy Institute. And Colleen also serves on UMKR steering committee as a liaison for GBCS, and it has been a privilege and continues to be for us to work with her. So welcome, Colleen.
Yes, thank you so much, Teresa, and thank you to UMKR and MFSA for having me and taking this opportunity to reflect and celebrate our accomplishments at General Conference this year. So I will be taking a few minutes to talk about Palestine-related legislation that was submitted by UMC general agencies, both the General Board of Church and Society, my agency, and the General Board of Global Ministries. So first, I'll overall mention that all of these petitions I'll be talking about, and also the ones that Lisa talked about, and a lot of the other priorities we'll be talking about tonight as well, passed with overwhelming support. The resolutions I'll be talking about, they all passed out of committee either unanimously or near unanimously, meaning it went on the consent calendar on the plenary floor. So multiple petitions were voted on at once. And these consent calendar items also received overwhelming support on the plenary floor, reflecting the will of the church in support of our advocacy for peace in Palestine and Israel. So the first resolution I will mention is called Opposition to Israeli Settlements. This is really the bedrock resolution of the United Methodist Church on Palestine, as it describes the conditions of the Israeli occupation and states the church's position, which is, and as I quote from the resolution directly, the United Methodist Church opposes continued military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and also the Syrian Golan Heights, the confiscation of Palestinian land and water resources, the destruction of Palestinian homes, the continued blockade of Gaza, where over half the residents are children, the military detention of Palestinian children, often without trial, the continued building of illegal Jewish settlements, and any vision of a greater Israel that includes the occupied territories and the whole of Jerusalem and its surroundings. The actions that this resolution calls for include a global ban on importing products from Israeli settlements, an end to all arms sales to the region and all arms purchases from the region, a redistribution of the large military aid given to Israel and Egypt to fund humanitarian work, such as UNRWA's, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, which is a relief agency, as well as all companies stopping any business activities that support ongoing military occupation. So as I said, this resolution has really been the cornerstone to the church's advocacy at GBCS and across the connection, and it really grounds our work for a ceasefire, for an arms embargo, an end to the occupation, and human rights, equality, justice, and accountability for Palestinians and for all in the Middle East, as well as boycotting products from the Israeli settlements. The next resolution I will talk about is UN resolutions on the Israel-Palestine conflict. So this resolution draws upon the core principles of international law and United Nations resolutions as the basis for equality and just peace for all in Israel and Palestine. In this resolution, the Church calls upon the United States and all permanent members of the UN Security Council to accept the authority of Security Council resolutions, to refrain from vetoing resolutions, and abide by Security Council resolutions 242, 338, and 2334, as well as all other relevant UN resolutions and International Court of Justice rulings that provide a framework for bringing this conflict to a just and permanent end. And lastly, I'll talk about the resolution Holy Land tours. So this resolution calls on United Methodists to practice responsible tourism when visiting the Holy Land and consider more than ancient history and biblical sites. It provides guidelines for what United Methodists should do on their trips, including staying overnight in Bethlehem, spending time discussing the concerns of Palestinian Christians and other advocates for justice in Palestine, getting advice and help in planning their trip from UMC agencies and missionaries, and several more recommendations are in the resolution. Palestinian Christians have long implored their fellow believers around the world to come and see the reality of their lives under military occupation. This resolution urges all United Methodist leaders to hear that urgent call and to plan their tours in the Holy Land with the intention to see and learn about current conditions there and to use well this unique opportunity to share in the vocation of peacemaking. And I'll just add that I traveled to the West Bank and Jerusalem earlier this year with Presbyterian Church USA's Israel-Palestine Mission Network, and we were hosted by Sabeel in Jerusalem, which is one of the trips that abides by this resolution, along with some other tours that you can learn about taking. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of this Holy Land Tours resolution, as people need to see the full situation with their own eyes, and not only come and see, but go back to their home countries and go and tell their family, their friends, communities, elected officials about what they saw and about the Palestinians they met with and their stories. And it's so pivotal for people to spend time overnight in Bethlehem and talk with Palestinian Christians there, and also support the people of Bethlehem with where and how they're spending their money on food, hotels, souvenirs. I can tell you, being there just a few months ago, that tourism is so down in Bethlehem and the shopkeepers are really hurting. And so many tours, some of these Holy Land tours might just pop over to Bethlehem for a day to see these ancient biblical sites and not actually spend time or your money there, which is why this resolution is so, so important to adhere to ensure that you are hearing from and supporting Palestinian Christians and getting their narrative and their perspective. So overall, there is so much to celebrate about these resolutions that pass at General Conference. I can't overemphasize how important and how much we should be celebrating that these resolutions not only pass, but pass with overwhelming support, because it reflects the will of the church to continue our steadfast advocacy, but also just want to name that there's so much work ahead of us to follow through on these commitments. And as Teresa said at the beginning of this call, amidst this genocidal violence that Israel is committing and the continuing conflict in Palestine and Israel. So we definitely need to stop and reflect and celebrate and continue on our advocacy. So with that, I will pass it back to Teresa. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Colleen, for those words of wisdom and for bringing us those excellent resolutions that you and other staff successfully ushered to passage at General Conference. We are so grateful to our general agencies for the leadership that both GBGM and GBCS staff have shown for decades on this issue. And as you said, these have been the foundation of United Methodist advocacy for Palestine for so long before UMKR even existed. All right, well, we are going to look at just a little bit more of what happened at General Conference regarding Palestine, in addition to all the legislation that we just heard about. Palestine was a continual subject of discussion and attention throughout the conference. We heard prayers and statements from the main podium many times during the conference, and there are other ways that it stayed in the hearts and minds of delegates, particularly with two powerful witness actions that happened during the conference. And I want to bring you tiny excerpts of videos we have of those actions. We will have the full videos of those, in addition to the video of this webinar, all together on one page on our website after we get this webinar posted. So you're just seeing the tiniest little bit of what we have of recordings of those actions. The first one is not the first one that happened at General Conference. I'd like to show you first one that UMKR did not organize, but we supported in a very big way. students of our seminaries, United Methodist seminaries across the country, wanted to organize a vigil for Gaza. It was deeply on their hearts that they needed to do something specifically about the genocide happening in Gaza. And that is what this is a short clip of. These were students from many schools, United Methodist seminaries across the country. And the schools that are represented here that you're about to see include the Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, the Methodist Theological School in Ohio, Garrett Evangelical in Evanston, Illinois, Boston University School of Theology, Duke Divinity School in North Carolina, Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and Drew Theological Seminary in New Jersey. So let me make this transition to sharing my screen with you. And
Grace Rogers. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, and I am a first-year MDiv student at Candler School of Theology. I am out here today because I think it's important for the United Methodist Church to know that its students at its sponsored seminaries care about Palestine, care about divestment, and I specifically am here because my loved ones back at Candler have been protest and have been met with support and with explicit non-support of their efforts in peace. So I'm here for them because I can't be there with them.
Solidarity is a love language. Resistance is a love language. Yes. Yes. Free Palestine.
You heard right at the end of that, a woman speaking, and that was a spontaneous statement of solidarity from one of the many people who witnessed this action. This action, I think, made quite an impact on a lot of people there. We heard from people afterward that it did. And you may have noticed cameras. It was also carried by media outlets. So it influenced a lot of people in the public, especially in that region where it was carried in the press. It's really inspiring to all of us in UMKR that this future generation of our church has this so much on their hearts. And we know is going to carry this cause forward throughout our denomination. Before this took place, and I believe the date for this was April 30th, a few days earlier, on April 25th, UMKR organized our main witness action at General Conference. It was a march, a singing march actually, inside the conference center and a rally on the street outside the convention center. Yeah, wait one moment. I want to give a big shout out to Paula Roderick, who was the major organizer of both the march and the rally. And in the march, you're going to see Katie Reamer, who so beautifully led the singing march through the convention center. Both Paula and Neil were excellent MCs for the rally that took place outside the convention center. And you're going to get now just a couple of very short clips of people that spoke at the rally. And again, the full video of what we have from that rally is going to be on our website, along with the page where we have this webinar. So,
Join us right now for Palestine. Join us right now for Palestine. Let Gaza live. Let Gaza live. Let Gaza won't be silent anymore. Somebody kill me, our children, and it's gone on. Far too long. It's gone on. Far too long. Yes, it's gone on. Far too long. Genocide. No more 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 genocide. Let Gaza live. Let Gaza live. Somebody's hurting my sister, and it's gone on.
Far too long.
Oh yes, it's gone on.
Far too long.
Oh yes, it's gone on.
Far too long.
And we won't
Be silent anymore.
and we won't
Be silent anymore.
In the words of Dr. King, a man dies when he refuses to stand up for that which is right. A woman dies when she refuses to stand up for justice. A woman dies when she refuses to take a stand for that which is true. We know those words from Dr. Martin Luther King, and he spoke those prophetic words to encourage people to take action. Good afternoon. My name is Paula Rado, and we are gathering here to consider what does justice look, feel, smell, and act like for Palestinian brothers and sisters.
I want to thank United Methodist for what you are doing here in this conference. But I want to say, this is not enough. You can do more. Amen? Yes, please do more. How many more Palestinian children in Gaza has to be killed before you act aggressively? Isn't 15,000 Palestinian children killed in Gaza? Isn't that enough? How about
in 2023, it is still happening. Apartheid is not right. My brothers and sisters, there's something that made apartheid South Africa fall. It was when the world began to see that apartheid is bad. They divested. They boycotted apartheid. They sanctioned apartheid. And that is what makes apartheid come to the end. United Methodist divest, sanction, and remove your money from making your brother suffer. Our dollars that we pray on every Sunday, that we pastors raise our hands and put to the cross, you take those and then invest them in apartheid. What a shame.
I'm speaking to you as an Israeli and as a Jew, and I'm asking you and I'm begging you, please stop the supply of weapons, stop the supply of arms, stop the supply of money, stop the impunity, stop the diplomatic support, stop enabling Israeli crimes. They are not helping us, they are killing us. These crimes are crimes that are unforgivable. These are crimes that we will have to live with the consequences of these for many generations to come. In the name of the future of these two peoples in this land, the Holy Land of Palestine, of Israel, we need to make it stop.
Well, as I said, that's just a few clips, and we had a number of other remarkable speakers in this rally. One of them is with us today, Colleen Moore. Colleen, I'm sorry we didn't have a clip of your extraordinary, impassioned speech to the crowd that day, but people will get to see that on the website. We also had Enger Muzatake, who is staff at the United Methodist General Commission on Religion and Race. We had Khalid Hajizi, who's a Palestinian and a longtime organizer right there in Charlotte, in his own community, and in particular with churches in the Charlotte community. You saw Lloyd Nierota. We heard from Paula at the beginning. We also had Suanne Ware Diaz and Ragiv Rain, two prominent leaders in the Native American caucus of our denomination. And I may have missed a couple of others. The rally was closed out by Bishop Hope Morgan Ward, who beautifully closed us with a call to everyone there to pledge ourselves to keep striving for justice and peace in Palestine and Israel. And close to a dozen other United Methodist bishops who attended the rally stood with her at the front in solidarity at that closing call for action, which was one of the most gratifying things I think about the rally, to see the witness of support and solidarity from our bishops. So that is our presentation of what happened at General Conference related to Palestine. There were some other things I missed probably, and including our booth and our wonderful volunteers, of whom we had a couple of dozen that we are so grateful to, and who made all of these things possible. But now we're going to move to some of the other historic and headline-making actions that happened at General Conference. The first thing that we're going to hear about is the extraordinary changes in policy of our church regarding our LGBTQ members and clergy. And to bring that to us, Bridget Cabrera will be presenting. Bridget is the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action, and she is truly a mission-driven leader who is committed to building strong teams and powerful partnerships in our church. Bridget has served as Deputy Director of the Reconciling Ministries Network. She's a leader in the Love Your Neighbor Coalition, and she has served as Executive Secretary for National Ministries with United Methodist Women, which is now United Women in Faith. For decades, RMN and MFSA have mobilized the church for the goals of full LGBTQ inclusion and equality in the life of this church. Having served in leadership at both RMN and MFSA, Bridget is an ideal person to bring us these achievements of those goals at General Conference this year. So welcome, Bridget.
Thanks, Teresa. General Conference delegates, by sizable majorities, voted to remove the discriminatory language and policies that exclude our LGBTQ+ siblings from the life of our church. We have been in a 52-year-long struggle for LGBTQ+ inclusion in this denomination, and that is only the struggle that has where it's been codified in our denomination. It goes further beyond that. Another struggle that has forced our United Methodist Church to consider what kind of church we want to be. And over that long history, there have been organizing efforts by relatively small caucus groups to make change by changing the hearts and minds of one person at a time, one Sunday school class at a time, and one church at a time. Now, this work first started with the Gay Caucus, which evolved into Affirmation. Then came an ecumenical program that was developed called the Reconciling Church Program, which evolved into its own organization that we know of as the Reconciling Ministries Network. My organization, Methodist Federation for Social Action, together with Affirmation and RMN, helped to build a strong intersectional coalition that we now call the Love Your Neighbor Coalition. UMKR is also a part of that coalition. We call it LINK for short. In this one general conference, essentially all of the discriminatory policies were eliminated from our book of discipline concerning LGBTQIA+ people. I just want that to sink in. That's incredible. The incompatibility clause, which is a statement that essentially all the other policies had been built upon, was removed from the social principles. The ban on same-sex marriage, the ban on LGBTQ+ clergy, serving as clergy, and many, many, many policies that are just too long to list out in the webinar. Many, each of these linked to another policy here, they're threaded throughout our entire book of discipline. Many of these monumental actions, as was mentioned before by, I think it was Colleen that spoke earlier, many of these actions were also adopted on the consent calendar, which is pretty incredible. Meaning that there were fewer than 10 votes against it in committee. So either they were unanimous or fewer than 10 people voted against them in committee. And they also did not get pulled off the consent calendar. And to get something pulled off the consent calendar, you only need a group of at least 20 delegates. And so that also didn't happen. So I think those are big monumental pieces. General Conference also passed legislation to set forth a process for LGBTQ+ people whose credentials were removed to be reinstated, and people who were moving forward in the ordination process, whose ordination process was either cut short or drawn out, a process for folks to come back to either be reinstated as clergy or to be able to start that process in a more expedited way. Now, we celebrate the removal of these policies as a denomination. It is a big thing to celebrate. And I will also say it is a first step. We do not technically officially celebrate or affirm LGBTQIA+ people in the United Methodist Church. And I just want to be clear about that. Our legislative action simply deleted the discrimination on a policy level. We have essentially gone to neutral. Removing harmful language is much different than changing the culture and systemic harm of a denomination. A church and a local church can still decide to not allow same-sex marriage on its property. Clergy have and will continue to decide if they will perform a wedding or if they won't. Board of Ordained Ministries will decide if candidates progress in the ordination process or not. There is still much work to do. I do want to share this quote. Bishop Tracy Smith Malone preached at General Conference, and she said this: "Let us imagine a church that reclaims the priority of discipleship." And I'm talking about a radical kind of discipleship that is grounded in the love and the teachings and example of Jesus Christ. I want you to imagine with me every local church loving well, a church that recognizes God's divine image in everyone, and each one is regarded as beloved, no matter their race, their ethnicity, their age, their orientation, their status, or even location. Let us imagine a church where nobody is marginalized. And I want to say that is essentially the work ahead of us. We have removed these policies that kind of held us back from in the denomination. And the big step is implementing them. So at a denominational level, there's no longer kind of a bar from access. And also it will mean a lot of work at the annual conference level, district level, organizing around local churches as well, to also see that this legislation is carried out in all of these places, and also that we're working to continue to change hearts and minds, and continue to organize to change the systemic practices of our denomination. And I'll throw this back to Teresa. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bridget. That really is extraordinary. That the struggle of half a century has culminated in the achievement of the end of these discriminatory policies. And we also heed your words about this just being the beginning. And we still have work ahead of us. And next we are bringing back Colleen Moore of GBCS, and she's going to present for us the revised social principles that were adopted at General Conference. This revision of the social principles was a huge undertaking all over the world in our church. And Colleen is going to help us understand why it was done and what these new social principles bring to our church. So welcome again, Colleen.
Yes, thank you so much. And hi again, everybody. So yes, talking about the revised social principles, which now that they are adopted by the General Conference are no longer called the revised social principles, but we'll just refer to them as the social principles as adopted by General Conference. So as you all know, all of the sections of the social principles were officially adopted at General Conference. So this historic vote comes after 12 years of development and engagement from thousands of United Methodists around the world. The 2012 General Conference set GBCS on an amazing journey to revise the social principles. So statements on urgent matters of peace and justice and the integrity of God's creation are clearer, more concise, more deeply theological, and reflect and speak to the realities across our worldwide connection. More than 50 participants served on the writing teams to revise the social principles. Members came from the 5 U.S. jurisdictions and 6 central conferences. More than 4,000 United Methodists offered feedback on preliminary drafts. The team received over 2,500 online responses, and over 2,000 people participated in the public conversations that were convened across the global connection in an 8-year span. So the social principles is a globally relevant document with strong theological and biblical grounding. The revised document's global perspective is a resource for mission and ministry, equipping churches to do ministry in their local context. The principles are aligned with references to the United Methodist Book of Discipline and are biblically grounded. The process created a more globally relevant and coherent document. And this is really a document for the whole church, for Sunday school classes, Bible studies, preaching from the pulpit, and teaching in seminary classes. So reflecting the church's convictions, the revised social principles document has 4 main sections. So that's community of all creation, social community, economic community, and political community. So the social principles really embodies the heart of the social creed by continuing to address today's important issues facing communities and individuals in a practical way. This document stands in the Wesleyan method of theological development based on scripture, along with tradition, reason, and Christian experience to live out the gospel in every arena of life, which is the Wesleyan quadrilateral. For each area, Wesleyan quote and scriptural reference grounds the section, as well as a reasoned, experienced understanding of the topic. So on some of the main changes from the previous social principles, the 6 sections were condensed into 4. Previously, the World Community section isolated global issues into 1 section, and United Methodists urged integrating the topics from this section into the others. And the number of sections was reduced from 76 to 51 subsections. Just some changes on the specific sections. In the Community of Creation section, the writing and editorial teams added language about Indigenous peoples in the sections environmental racism, food justice, and affirming science and traditional wisdom. In the political community section, new language on extrajudicial killings was added because it speaks to contexts where political acts are practiced by governments, included but not limited to the Philippines. The writing team also added a new section called Colonialism, Neocolonialism, and Their Consequences, based on conversations with Africa and the Philippines. In the economic community section, Feedback from communities on the African continent, the Philippines, and Eurasia urged adding new language in poverty and income inequality that rejected the prosperity gospel teaching that the accumulation of wealth was a sign of God's favor. And then finally, in the social community section, language was added on inheritance rights and widows, as African United Methodists expressed concern about denying inheritance rights for vulnerable women, children, and grandchildren upon the death of the husband. So overall, the adoption of these social principles at General Conference was so historic, and as Teresa, you mentioned, was a very long process and just such an amazing journey that it took GBCS on. And we should really celebrate that, and the fact that these passed so overwhelmingly, both in committee and on the plenary. So not only celebrate that, but to push everyone across a connection to use, promote, and bring these social principles to life in their context all over the world, and however it makes sense in their local context. So thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Teresa.
Thank you again, Colleen. That was a great presentation of some of the highlights of the social principles, which we will no longer call revised. I think it's a valuable thing that we did this, and particularly appropriate at this general conference, because it was another way that we moved into a more decolonial framework for our church, in the way that we do church, for the kind of church we are, because it involved the voices of so many United Methodists around the world to shape the social principles that we adopted this year. And that was a big theme, huge theme at this general conference, decolonizing our church and becoming a decolonialist body, denomination. And one of the biggest ways, maybe the biggest way that we did that, was with regionalization legislation. And that is the last specific topic that we're going to hear about now. And last is definitely not least. In fact, we're closing with that because we really want that to resonate with you, and for you to hear what is needed next on this important legislation in our church. And to present that to us, we have Reverend Israel J. Alvaron, or Izzy, as many of us know him. He is the convener of the Christmas Covenant leadership team. The Christmas Covenant is the name for the original legislation for regionalization in our church. And we also use it as the name for the movement that has mobilized that vision throughout the denomination. Izzy is an elder in the California Pacific Conference today, and he has served in various ministry settings as a pastor, a youth minister, faculty at a UMC University and Seminary in the Philippines. He's a longtime activist, and he has extensive experience in community organizing for workers. He's currently serving as an organizer with Reconciling Ministries Network, RMN. Prior to joining RMN, he served as the national organizer for economic justice with the General Board of Church and Society. So Izzy will be explaining to us what regionalization is, what it can do for our church, and what we need to do to see it become a reality. So welcome, Izzy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you this new polity for the church called worldwide regionalization. So I'll ask Bridget if you could share the slides. There you go. You probably have heard about the Christmas Covenant, or if not, you've probably heard about worldwide regionalization from your bishop or from your district superintendent. So I hope that after this time together, you will know more about this exciting opportunity to restructure our denomination, to decolonize our structure, to decenter those that are in power, usually at General Conference, and give everybody equity in terms of legislative power. So next slide, please. So the goal of regionalization is to allow United Methodists to best connect to their communities, whether they be in Africa, I'm originally from the Philippines, and the United States or Europe. We all live in different circumstances, different contexts. Our neighborhoods are different. The needs of those around us are different. Our cultures are definitely different and special. With regionalization in place, we can all better minister to the people around us, because each region of the church can make decisions that will ensure ministry and outreach efforts will be successful in each of our specific settings. Every United Methodist can better live into our shared mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Next slide, please. Regionalization, the planning of this legislation has been underway for years, also because of the pandemic. The Christmas Covenant, which I have been convening since 2019, submitted the original regionalization legislation in time for the 2020 General Conference, which was postponed. And we have collaborated with the Connectional Table and the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters to submit an updated regionalization plan in time for the 2024 General Conference. And United Methodists from around the world, I can assure you that the Christmas Covenant team come from different central conferences. These are regions outside the United States, have all been part of developing this plan, and it was approved overwhelmingly at General Conference in 2024, earlier this year. Next slide, please. Regionalization creates equity. That's one of the goals here. It will every region of the church will have equal powers to do ministry, to enable them to do ministry in their own contexts. All parts of the denomination will be equal, which will help us build trust in each other as we continue to work and minister together. We will have the same rights and privileges. No longer will it seem that the United Methodist Church is centered in the United States, which has always been a critique of our system. Well, because the United Methodist Church started in this country, then went out and did mission, but now our work outside the United States has grown so much that we need to have a conversation about how we're going to be doing church together. Regionalization also dismantles colonialism, as all parts of the denomination embrace their autonomy, and regional conferences will all stand strong on equal footing. Next slide, please. The worldwide regionalization legislation proposes to change the names of the existing central conferences. These are regions outside the church, into regional conferences. It would also create a new U.S. regional conference, enabling the UMC in the United States to decide on specific U.S. matters. It will have the same powers and duties as all other regional conferences. And an interim regional committee will ease the transition as the U.S. regional conference prepares for its first meeting, assuming that we do ratify the amendments, but we will get into that later. The 5 U.S. jurisdictions will continue with a committee formed to study the future of those jurisdictions and perfect this new plan. Next slide. United Methodists will continue in mission together around the world. All regional conferences share the same constitution, doctrinal standards, and our theological task, the ministry of all Christians, and the social principles, all enacted by General Conference. These are going to be in our general book of discipline shared by all. These are not adaptable by regional conferences. Next slide, please. It's important to note that regionalization does not change what all United Methodists believe. Our beliefs are at the center of everything we do. They are what ground us, unite us, and lead us forward. These are all in the Book of Discipline. This will not change. These are in our Articles of Religion and Confession of Faith. The updated Book of Discipline and Book of Resolutions will be available by the end of this year. But those doctrines are not changing. Next slide, please. With regionalization, we will also see no changes when it comes to the Council of Bishops, the Judicial Council, general agencies of the church, and General Conference. These structures of the church will remain the same. Next slide. Regionalization will definitely transform General Conference. Usually the agenda of General Conference is mostly dominated by U.S. topics. But because a lot of the work of ministry and legislation will be done in the regions, the conversation at General Conference and the agenda will be for matters and issues that deal with everybody in the whole church. And General Conference will keep full legislative powers on all matters distinctly connectional for all regions, and will decide with a 60% majority what regional conferences are allowed to adapt. Next slide, please. So here are some things that regional conferences can't do. First, they cannot create their own constitution or adopt any policy in violation of the constitution contained in the Book of Discipline. Next slide. As I said earlier, regional conferences cannot alter the doctrinal standards or theological tasks, the ministry of all Christians, or the social principles. These include our beliefs, our statements about our ministries, other important parts about what it means to be United Methodist across the connection. Next slide. Now, here are things that regional conferences can do. First, draft and publish their own regional book of discipline, their own hymnals, books of worship, and other liturgical resources. This is what central conferences have been doing for some time, and that will not change. The biggest change here is that the U.S. regional conference would now be able to do the same, have our own hymnal, our own liturgy, that's based in our context in the United States. Next slide. Second, a regional conference can set requirements for ordination and license ministry with respect to their needs and resources. This is also something central conferences have been doing all along, and now the U.S. can do for itself. Next slide. Third, a regional conference can set standards for lay membership. Not new for central conferences, but will be new for a U.S. regional conference. Next slide. A regional conference can develop practices around marriage ceremonies, funerals, and other rites that align with cultural contexts and laws of each country. Next slide. A regional conference can reorganize their annual conferences, their districts or charge conference to best serve their missional needs and convene their own judicial courts. Central conferences are already doing this. The problem in our current context, hopefully this is ratified, is that the U.S. goes to General Conference for all of its issues, including reorganizing a lot of our work here in the U.S. Now it will go to the regional conference, and that is true across the board. Next slide. Regional conferences can work with annual conferences to ensure policies and practices align with the laws of each country. You know, there are some regional conferences and even annual conferences that span countries. There are multiple countries in some annual conferences or regions of the church. So they would have to work with them. This is also true in Europe. This is true in Africa. And then they can make sure that their policies align with the context, their countries. Next slide. So what's the next step? The next step for regionalization to be put in place is amending the United Methodist Constitution. One petition, petition 1 of worldwide regionalization are all constitutional amendments. And if we're ratifying amendments to the book of the Constitution of the United Methodist Church, we need to pass by 2/3 aggregate vote all of these amendments in all annual conferences around the world. When I say 2/3 aggregate, you add all the votes across all annual conferences, you need to get 2/3 of all the total votes cast. So ballots will be available by the end of 2025, I mean, January 31st, 2025. And then we'll vote next year, the whole year, because we're having annual conferences at different times. The US usually has annual conferences in June. And by the end of next year, the Council of Bishops will ultimately will count and then ultimately announce if we have ratified these amendments. So we encourage you to host study sessions on regionalization. Make sure your pastors and delegates know about this amendment so they will be ready to support them when your annual conference convenes in June next year. And last slide. And I think some of the links are also in the chat. If you have any more questions, the links are there, and you can contact the connectional table. You can also connect with me at RMN. We still have the Christmas Covenant team that has turned into a ratification team that meets monthly. We meet every Tuesday morning, second Tuesday morning of the month. So if you have any questions, we'll be ready to answer after this Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Izzy. That was a wonderful, comprehensive, and again, very accessible, easy to understand explanation of regionalization and what it does and does not do in our church. Obviously, we have our work cut out for us if we want to see this adopted around the world in the United Methodist Church. So some very big next steps that Izzy has just laid out for us for this legislation. And we also heard from Bridget about what is needed to build on what was accomplished for LGBTQ inclusion and equality in our church. She made the very strong and good point that this legislation was just a first step. Our church does not yet affirm LGBTQIA plus people. We've simply gone to neutral, as she put it, removed the negative language, but changing the culture of the church is a much bigger task and takes time. And that is the work ahead for us. So presumably we will be hearing more from MFSA, RMN, and others about how can we implement the import of this legislation to change hearts and minds in our congregations and make sure that discriminatory policies and practices are actually eradicated from our conferences and our congregations. And finally, going back to the beginning, we have all of the Palestine-related legislation, and there was quite a bit. We're going to have a question coming up for Colleen about some of that, but jumping past Colleen to Lisa's presentation, Lisa gave us a number of things that we can consider as next steps. In particular for divestment, we can be contacting Westpath ourselves, and you are going to have an opportunity to do that through UMKR to let them know that you support and believe in, and along with thousands of other United Methodists, this divestment resolution that passed, and would like to see Westpath follow through on it. We can also ask our annual conferences and our own congregations to divest of their investments, which many of them do have. And UMKR is going to come out with a guide on a variety of ways that we can, in our own locales and working with others in the church, can pursue divestment. That will be part of a larger collection of study resources, study and action resources that we are going to be publishing this fall for the Palestine-related legislation that was adopted at General Conference. And that will include all of that legislation, UMKR's and the general agencies legislation, just to help people understand the importance of what is in those, to unpack them, do a bit of studying, embrace them as a congregation and as a conference. So we will make a big announcement when we are publishing those materials, and you will definitely hear about it. We have next steps also for the Palestinian children. You saw in the chat, and you can find it on the homepage of our website, an action to contact Congress about an important piece of legislation that defends the rights of Palestinian children and families, legislation in the U.S. Congress. And for the right to boycott, Lisa gave us several actions that we can consider, how to advocate with legislators, educate people in your community with the film Boycott, and join a coalition in your state. And you can find a lot of information about that on our website in our navigation bar under the heading Boycott. And there were links in the chat about that. All of those links will be on the page where we post the webinar. the video of this webinar, and that will be true for MFSA and UMKR on our websites. And we also post these videos on our YouTube channels, so they will not be hard to find. All right, friends, that brings us to the end of the formal program, and we only have time for one question, and we did go a little bit over. We expected to be 90 minutes for this webinar, and we're just about there. And the primary question that we have had is, excuse me, I just lost it. No. What role is the Board of Church and Society filling in these efforts? As a member of my conferences board, I would like to make sure we build on that. And I'm going to add to that one with this other question. What resources are available for local churches to study and become familiar with the social principles? And Colleen, we're sending those to you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for these questions. Well, on the first part of it, what role GBCS is playing, yeah, certainly carrying out the commitments named in these resolutions that passed. Specifically on the Palestine resolutions, we are first and foremost carrying out advocacy efforts. So encouraging members of Congress to support a ceasefire and an arms embargo and other related efforts. Like I know Lisa mentioned earlier, a bill addressing Israeli detention of children. We're part of larger faith and secular coalitions in DC that are working together strategically to pressure our government on these issues. Like we're part of Churches for Middle East Peace that works for prophetic witness for peace in Palestine. For example, we held a prayer vigil on Capitol Hill on the day of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to DC back in July, alongside continuing to pursue this congressional work. So in annual conferences, we really encourage you to call on your members of Congress, especially right now, to advocate for an arms embargo. I think that's really the most important thing right now, because I think, of course, continuing to advocate for a ceasefire, it is so important to have a ceasefire right now. But as we know, the U.S. as a negotiator in this, they're not exactly a neutral negotiator. So the biggest thing right now is the arms embargo. I mean, there's been billions of dollars that the administration has sent to Israel. And so we're working with a few senators to introduce a joint resolution of disapproval on these weapons sales and looking for support for that. We had 11 senators back in January who supported a different resolution that said the weapons transfers to Israel violates the Foreign Assistance Act that says any security assistance provided by the U.S. to any country has to advance human rights and avoid identification of the U.S. with any violation of these rights. So yeah, some of these priorities are changing depending on the political atmosphere. I'm anticipating, it will continue to be like this with the election, with so much focus on the election. But yeah, especially if you're part of your church and society board, I would love to chat about this and how we can support you. Definitely reach out to me. I'm happy to put my email in the chat to resource some of that. And we have like calls with church and society chairs and peace with justice coordinators. And I know a lot of you are on the call right now. So please definitely reach out and we can chat. And I think the other part of this, especially after returning from Palestine earlier this year, I think one of the most important actions you can take is considering where the money goes. I mean, part of the opposition to Israeli settlements resolution is asking all companies that profit from or support settlements through their business activities to examine these and stop any business that contributes to serious violations of international law, promotes systemic discrimination, or otherwise supports ongoing military occupation. So I think education within your conferences and within your churches is really, really important on your financial decisions and where you decide to buy your products, as well as supporting and engaging with the boycotting of these goods that are emanating from illegal settlements, on top of what Teresa was talking about with divestment as well. So on all of these items, please reach out to me if you'd like resources. I can pop my email in the chat. And then on the second part of it with these social principles, I think there was a link put in the chat. I'm happy to share that again. We have a whole page on our website with resources on the social principles. But I will say, so they are not officially the social principles of the church right now. They become officially used by the church in January. So please come back to our website in January. We'll actually have a lot more resources on our website. But in the meantime, I can put this resource page from our website. And so a lot of these kind of turned the revised social principles language that we had in some of the resources before General Conference and kind of turned them into post General Conference resources that you can use in your conference. But yeah, I promise that we will have even more resources to share when they become the official adopted or the official social principles in use in January 2025. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Colleen. That was really helpful. I hope that answered the question of the person who asked it. And I would invite any of the speakers that want to put an email address in the chat to do so, and people can contact you with further questions. And also you can contact us directly, email UMKR or MFSA and ask us how to reach these folks in that. If they prefer not to put their address in the chat, and yet they are doing that. Great. So thank you all very much. You were tremendous speakers. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to turn this back over now to our host, Bridget Cabrera.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This webinar was recorded, and that recording will be made public in the coming days. Often they're also shared in our newsletters, so kind of stay tuned for that. Either from UMKR or MFSA, they'll both be shared in both. And I believe they're also hosted on our YouTube channel, so sometimes you can check it out there early. I would encourage you to share it with folks that you think might be interested. Share it with your Sunday school classes, folks in your church. And please plan to join us on our next webinar. It'll be in November. We will hear from individuals who attended a solidarity delegation with Sabeel, and we'll have more information about that to come, including the way to register, what date and time, and all of that good stuff. But be on the lookout from UMKR and MFSA on those dates. Thank you again, and we will see you next time.